Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's RedZone podcast. I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of exponential technologies, business innovation, entrepreneurship, thought leadership, enterprise IT security, neuroscience, philosophy, personal development, and more. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, everybody. This is Bill Murphy, your host of the RedZone podcast. Today, my guest is David Bray, who's the CIO of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. And if you're interested in business IT leadership, exponential change, how you bring innovation into your organization, and how you really make big things happen, then you're going to love my interview with David. I actually went into DC to spend some time with David, and he's transformed over 207 different systems to completely different legacy systems into award-winning cloud-based solutions. And he's achieved these results in half the time and a sixth of the cost. He was FCW's Fed 100 winner in 2015. He's been named as 24 Americans Changing the World Under 40 by Business Insiders. He was selected as one of the FedScoop 50 for leadership in 2014. And he's been voted and named the most social CIO globally in 2015 by both Forbes magazine and the Huffington Post. And he tweets under the handle FCC_CIO. And we even get into talking how he made that happen. He's received the Arthur S. Fleming Award, the Roger W. Jones Award for Executive Leadership in 2013, and he's been named an Eisenhower Fellow to meet with leaders in Taiwan and Australia on multi-sector cyber strategies for the Internet of Everything in 2015. And even in 2009, he was deployed to Afghanistan to think differently on military and humanitarian issues. And he later completed his PhD in information systems from Emory University and 2 postdoctoral associateships at MIT and Harvard in 2008. He's also worked as an IT chief for the Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Program at the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, leading the program's technology response during 9/11, the anthrax scare, and the severe acute respiratory systems in 2003 and other international public health emergencies. So David's been at this since he's been age 15, and I'm going to wait for those stories to unfold, but we get into how he actually built this success of his from an early age. From I think we started maybe around 12 or 13 years old, and he kept sharing stories of how he built this knowledge base of his and this success that he's experienced personally and professionally. So what you're going to learn from my conversation is his unique perspective on leadership, his approach to experiments and risk-taking, and how he curates ideas in his organization, and really what I call more of the portfolio effect, and how he can test ideas and curation within his organization, and how also he brings outside innovation in. So kind of like a Silicon Valley-esque thinking into his organization, and his unique approach to being looked at himself as a VC of an internal venture capitalist. And we go into his book recommendations and leadership principles, and we have all sorts of fun, and I think you'll enjoy listening to our conversation. This episode is sponsored by RedZone Technologies, which I founded 16 years ago, a month before 9/11. And RedZone is essentially a SEAL team unit for enterprise IT security. Typically, we're brought in by the top IT business leaders to assess the current state of the IT security environment. IT security is complex, and we have a unique process and method for unraveling the complexity so that remediation can be taken and we can build up a defensible program to address audit, compliance, or just good old-fashioned appropriate IT security spending just based on risk and exposure to the business. So understanding the gaps that exist and then prioritization of what happens first, second, third is all incorporated. Our plans are laid out on a transparent roadmap of execution with a predetermined budget, so the CIO all the way to the board knows exactly what to expect from staff, partners, vendors, and consultants. So go to redzonetech.net to learn more about how my team can help you. Again, that's redzonetech.net. Now, let's get into my fun and engaging interview with Dr. David Bray. Well, David, I want to welcome you to the show today.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
So what got you to where you are today? Like, maybe we can go back to high school and college. Like, did you always have aspirations of being at the top, a leader in that regard, or did this sort of evolve, throughout time?
So I can remember being about 5 or 6 and honestly seeing James Bond movies. And I think that's what I wanted to do.
James Bond, I love it.
So I don't know if that's where I ended up. I can't say probably. One, I think James Bond is probably a myth, but it's an interesting myth. But probably by about 12 or 13, 2 things happened. One, my parents said, we fully support you going to college. However, if you want to go to anything other than a state school, my father was a Methodist minister, my mom was a school teacher. If you want anything other than a state school, you're probably going to have to get a scholarship.
Mm.
And so that then triggered a second thing, which was at the time, the 2 classes I was really good at were both English and science.
Okay.
And when you survey the landscape of what's likely to give you a scholarship, it's probably science.
Yeah. Those were the 2 strengths of yours, English and science.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
My father actually, my father was a British literature major, and again, later chose to be a Methodist minister. My mom was also a school teacher, English as a second language.
Okay.
And so I think that helped with the English bit. In terms of science, they actually claim they don't know where I came from. They said maybe I fell in my head at an early age, which might be the case. But my grandfather had bought a personal computer, an IBM PC, when I was 5. Nobody else in the family really touched it. So starting on 5 on up, this was an IBM PC with 64 kilobytes of RAM.
Okay.
Taught myself how to program, started with BASIC, then later C, and then assembly, would take it apart, put it back together again, and then ended up building my own computers throughout the years. And so that then motivated me to start doing computer simulations and things I can do with computer simulations, just to sort of model the natural world. Because, again, you look around, I'd go to my dad's sermons on Sundays, and I'd try and understand what exactly is he trying to describe, and can I model it on a machine? And so that led to science fair projects that actually caught the eye of the U.S. government.
Really?
And they ended up offering me a job at what was called, at the time, it was called the Continuous Electron Beam Accelerator Facility. It's now called Jefferson Lab, which is much easier to say.
Sure.
But it was an electron beam accelerator facility, and they said, could you help build some computer models of the electron beam? Which, for a 15-year-old, is great. This was about 1992. It was actually the summer of 1993 that I actually did the internship.
Okay.
It was my freshman year, between my freshman and my sophomore years. And to be able to have access to the early days of the internet, pre-World Wide Web, Mosaic was a web browser.
This is prior to the real consumer
exactly.
grade.
Mosaic 1.0, and Netscape was still a gleam in the eye in some respects of Mark Andreessen. Gopher and Archie were the protocols. And so, it was...
Gopher.
Entire world. Yeah, Gopher. Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
So I sort of got in at the ground floor and then watched what happened. Maybe it's because I was in a government environment. Between my freshman year and my sophomore year, after that summer at the Electron Beam Accelerator facility, my parents moved up to a different church in the D.C. area,
okay,
in Alexandria. I went to T.C. Williams High School, and that's when I first volunteered with the soil conservation movement while I was a sophomore. So I was still going to school, but I was one of those people that school by itself didn't necessarily always interest me. So I needed something on the side. And so this was a chance to maybe build a computer model. I was doing models of natural events.
What exactly is a model?
Yes. So one of the examples I did was an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico.
Oh, okay.
So it'd be a model of what are the current currents based on what NOAA knows about, what is the different weights of different oils and how might they spread.
Oh, I see.
And can I build something that says if I release this much oil at this much rate at this location, what are the different Monte Carlo probabilistic scenarios as to where it might go? And so, again, it was pretty much self-taught. To me, it was just fun. It was trying to understand the natural world. And so first worked for the soil conservation movement and then got approached by the Department of Defense for what was called Walter Reed Army Medical Center.
Oh, yeah.
And they were transferring images back and forth, X-ray images. The Balkans conflict was getting heated up. And they said, well, right now we're using a mainframe system. Do you have any recommendations? And I said, well, you could scrap the mainframe system and try and write something by scratch. But that's a lot of work, and it's going to cost a whole lot of money, and not what I recommend. So I actually recommend that they just do a new graphical user interface to the existing mainframe system.
Okay.
And so as a result, that saved them probably about 1/8 the price, and they could still do everything and get it done much faster than trying to commission a whole system from scratch. Also, I helped out with, they were moving from, if you remember, they were moving towards Ethernet.
Yes, that's right. Their own proprietary networks that didn't even mesh with the IP networks.
And it wasn't interoperable. And so that was a lot of fun. And then it was my junior year of high school. I got called down to the principal's office, and everyone was like, and literally there are 4 individuals, 3 of which were, well, actually, they were all in suits. 3 of them had dark glasses. I won't say sunglasses, but dark glasses. And another one was an individual by the name of Dr. William Jeffrey.
Oh, okay.
And he was with the Institute for Defense Analyses. It's a federally funded research development center. He said, would you like to work on some classified projects?
Oh, wow.
The science fair projects had customized, and I was like, sure.
It's well beyond your science fair, right? Yes. Well beyond the science fair.
And basically it was, there were small satellites that were legacies from the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization days, Star Wars programs days. Could we find civilian uses for it? And so, I mean, again, not even 18 yet. It was interesting. I had to fill out my security clearance form, and they said, what have you done since you're 18? I'm like, not 18 yet. They're like, okay, what did you do in the last 6 months? It was probably a very easy adjudication process. But underneath the tutorage of Dr. William Jeffrey, he said, well, what project do you want to do? And I said, well, can we model the spread of forest fires from space? If we can pick up a forest fire from space, we could probably do that. Can we scan the foliage? Could we scan the wind conditions? And then based on that, guess where the forest fire might go? And so he gave me carte blanche. So I worked part-time while in high school. Summer, I worked full-time. Senior year, it was my Westinghouse science fair project. Part of the challenge was I couldn't fully declassify it.
Okay.
The meter resolution that we were operating with at the time was kind of sensitive. But it was a wonderful exposure that there are exciting things that can happen within government. It's not everywhere. And I think I had a very, a rare opportunity at any age to be exposed to that. But that sort of, I guess maybe that was how I pivoted from wanting to do James Bond to what this is. Then went off to college. While I was good at computers, I said I was going to make myself understand biology, in particular evolutionary biology.
Okay.
Because I looked at it that in some respects, evolution is how selection pressures have programmed species.
Sure.
Not deterministic, but we have been shaped by, in some respects, what our environment has selected for. And so I wanted to understand how that happens so that I can understand the interface between something we design versus something that's not necessarily intentional design. It's just occurred as a result of biology. Briefly did a summer at NIH, also doing computer simulations. Well, I loved it. Was really complex protein folding. There was no human interaction. I realized I need to have some human interaction, else I'll go stir crazy. And so that led to me my sophomore year building a computer model of the spread of HIV/AIDS in South Africa.
Oh, okay.
So South Africa was interesting because while apartheid ended in 1994, and that was a good thing, unfortunately it also opened up their borders to the rest of Africa. And they went from having less than 5,000 cases reported of HIV/AIDS in 1994 for a country of about 40 million to 2.4 million in only 4 years.
Oh, my.
And
in 4 years?
In less than 4 years, in a country of 40 million, my model was saying that if they didn't take an intervention in the next 5 years, it was easily going to be 1 in 8 South Africans was going to have HIV/AIDS. 5 million. And so that was hugely challenging because the challenge was, one, the existing government, Thabo Mbeki, was claiming that HIV/AIDS was a Western myth.
Oh, wow.
There had also been some scandals where some scientists in South Africa had used a medication without going through any clinical trials that they claimed cured HIV/AIDS. It ended up, it caused chronic liver failure, and so it wasn't really a cure. And so I was trying to convince the papers to write about this issue. I was a volunteer journalist, in addition to doing computer science, and kept on hitting my head against the wall. And after talking to my journalism professor, he's like, well, maybe you just can't be objective. And I'm like, maybe I can't. Maybe that's my problem. I ended up, instead of focusing on a paper, I ended up using my last month of that internship teaching HIV/AIDS in the schools in the town of Kailicha, which is outside of Cape Town. I asked them, I said, so where do you get your information? And they said, we don't. No one ever talks about it. It's a taboo subject. If we do get any information, we have to go to the library. I'm like, that's a problem. So I came back from that experience in 1998, and I talked to my advisor and mentor. His name was Garland Richmond, Dr. Garland Richmond at Emory. And I said, kind of disillusioned, kind of in this ivory tower. Yet all these things are going on in the world. I might need to take a year off. He said, you can take a year off. Hopefully you'll come back. He said, just know, wherever you go, you'll always make a larger difference as an insider than you will as an outsider. I didn't quite understand what he meant at the time, but I took it under my wing. And ended up, I would work for Microsoft or Yahoo as like a short-term stint, 2 to 3 month programmer. Ended up being a project manager and software developer. This was the early days of the dot-com boom. And then I would take time off, about a month or 2 months, using those funds to volunteer as a Habitat for Humanity international crew leader. So my first place was the Philippines, and then I later did Romania, Ghana, Honduras, South Korea.
So this public service piece was developed. It was very early on for you.
On.
Okay.
Oh, and I actually say it was partly, from the get-go. Again, my parents chose what they did to be in service. And for me, I think I was doing the Habitat for Humanity international experiences because I was trying to, one, understand how the world can have a combination of good and bad at the same time happening. And I was trying to understand what can I do to try and address that. And one I found that was amazing was you'd come to these areas like Nepal. I was in Pokhara, which is to the southeast. They have generally not a lot. And here you are, and they would invite you as a stranger to their house, and they would offer you crackers and Coke, which is probably 2 to 3 weeks of their salary.
Right.
You can't say no, because that would be offending. But how many of us would welcome a complete stranger off the street into our house and offer anything near 2 to 3 weeks of our salary? And so I came to a theory that actually the less you have, you're sometimes happier. Actually.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's an advantage to be able to want what you have.
Right. You're more, and you just saw, the children could play in the field, and you could do a pickup game with soccer with, and again, you're complete strangers and they would welcome you. And so came back after all that, did finish my degree. And in the process of coming back to finish my degree, got approached by the Centers for Disease Control, and they said, which was right next to where I was going to school, Emory University, they said, we have this thing called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program.
Okay.
It was created because of sarin gas attacks that happened in 1990.
Right.
Also because in the 1970s, the former Russian republics, some of them had stockpiled smallpox. Couldn't find all the vials of smallpox, couldn't find all the scientists.
Oh, wow.
It was a concern. So they said, well, you have a background in computer science and biology. You also have some clearances. Would you do it? And I said, sure, I'll do it while I'm still going to college and maybe a year or two after I graduate. I don't see this as my career, but sure. It's kind of a mood killer at a party when people say, so what do you do? I do bioterrorism preparedness. And it's like, okay, next. It's not the most enthralling subject, but it is maybe getting close to James Bond. Who knows?
Right.
So I graduated and shifted to full-time status with the program and literally was supposed to brief the CIA and the FBI on September 11th, 2001 at 9 o'clock in the morning as to what we would do technology-wise if a bioterrorism event happened.
Sure.
Of course, 8:34, the world changed. We literally piled computers in the cars, set up an underground bunker, and then flew people to both D.C. and New York to do with the response.
Okay.
Did not sleep. If we slept, it was on the floor, and then we got back up. But we didn't sleep for about 3 weeks. October 1st, we stood down. October 3rd is when I flew up to Langley, gave my briefing, and then 24 hours later, the first case of anthrax was up. And initially, when I got back, and they told me, I was like, "You've got to be killing me." I just gave a briefing.
24 hours later?
It was the first case was in Florida. Now, it was one case at the time.
The Postal Service around that time, right?
So far, it had not shown up in the Postal Service yet.
Okay.
It was just one case of an individual presenting anthrax in Florida.
Okay.
Now, he worked at a publication, but we couldn't find any threat letters at the time. And so part of how medicine works is Occam's razor, which is what's the most likely. And so at the time, they thought, well, maybe he'd been exposed to anthrax through a sheep or sheep wool or something like that. But we did say in the program, we said, if you find out that there are threat letters or there's something to the postal system, you're going to need to start doing prophylaxis at speed. So a little bit of things also say in background with that whole experience. Prior to all of this, so the Agile Manifesto came out in March of 2001. I had been an early proponent of doing agile development. Partly from my days at Microsoft and Yahoo, I was like, you don't want to do waterfall, it's death.
Right, okay.
And so, of course, you want to do sprints. And what was interesting was the existing regime said, well, no, you've got to buy into the 5-year plan, the 5-year enterprise architecture. You don't get your budget for another 3 years because it takes 3 years to go through Congress. And I was like, we don't have a deal with the terrorists not to strike until we've got something ready.
We got to move fast here.
Move fast. And so I was a bit of a heretic. In fact, I think I irked some of the IT leadership at CDC.
Okay.
Because I was not buying into their enterprise architecture. Like, he doesn't understand. He's new. He'll get the understanding. He's not understanding waterfall. We've got this all planned out. And it's like, I've just got to get the program stuff done. So that happened. And then the other thing that happened when the Anthrax event started to unfold, what I witnessed was a lot of good people, but not working together well.
Okay.
In the sense that
kind of working as independently, but not as collaboratively.
They each had their own different hierarchies. I mean, CDC obviously was dealing with it as a public health event.
Yeah.
But the Anthrax events were also a crime scene. And so FBI also needed to be involved.
Okay.
I mean, I think the statistics are at the time, and this was 2001, so it may have changed, for any bioterrorism or chemical terrorism event, there would be at least 50 different agencies at the state, local, and federal level involved, depending on whether it was on the road
50.
or if it was in a park, just because it's all these different jurisdictions. I mean, clearly when the Constitution was written, the founders were not thinking about who gets oversight for a terrorism event. That's
right.
not. And so what I think we're dealing with is there are new emergent threats as a result of technology that was never conceived of before and that our existing organizational structures can't respond to well. And so it's not that these people don't mean well. In fact, they're extremely smart. It's just their reporting systems, their hierarchies, their incentives are all in verticals when in fact we need to be horizontal. So I saw that. Then we dealt with the response to West Nile. Then we dealt with, I was literally going to go home at about 6 o'clock at night when I got a call about this thing called atypical febrile illness in 2003.
Okay.
That was later turned out to be SARS. So we dealt with responses to serious respiratory syndrome. Monkeypox happened. There were some other things like ricin. Kind of eventful. And so at the time, my boss, which was with the U.S. Public Health Corps, he was a captain, later became an admiral, he said, you really want to make a difference. You can either get a rank of admiral, general, MD, or PhD. I was like, or wait 20 years. Okay. And
so to be heard, you had to sort of be at a certain
the right place. And so I said, seems like a PhD is the easiest one, I think. MD, I'd probably get, I after about 2 or 3 years, I'd want to go study something else. And they're like, well, no, you have to focus and you have to get through this. And so PhD seemed like that was the easiest. And so applied to 15 different places and ended up back at Emory. They just made the best offer. And I actually could use the data I had done at the CDC to get a PhD. But it was in the business school, which was kind of interesting because fortunately, my dissertation chair, Dr. Ben Kaczynski, he knew that I wanted to actually look at how to improve organizational response to disruptive events with the idea of applying it to public service.
Interesting.
The premise being that there's going to be more and more disruptive events, partly because of exponential change, but also just because globalization, our world is now increasingly connected. We should not be surprised that there's both disruption in a negative sense, but also disruption in a positive sense.
Sure.
That there are going to be these opportunities. That
our models are going to be turning upside down.
Right. And that it worked well in the 1770s when packet latency between New York and DC was 3 days and that was way on horseback. But we've now got milliseconds that are connecting us. And so to me, that was a fascinating question. It was interesting because I applied to schools of public policy and they're like, we don't get what you're saying. How does technology impact with public policy? And I was like,
You actually, when you were applying for those schools, what year was it?
This was 2005.
Yeah, because this is actually ahead of. I could see there are probably more schools that understand it today.
They do now,
but not then.
No, literally. I mean, 2005.
9 years ago.
Said, "What does technology have to do with public policy?" And I was like, "A lot." There's also some cases where, once I got accepted in a program, I would write articles on organizational science and how to improve responsiveness to disruptive events. And I'd submit them to schools, to journals that did public policy or political science, and they said, what does business and organizational science have to teach us about doing political science and public policy? It's like,
Well, it's interesting, the evolutionary biology interest and health interest in this response, because it seems to me that a lot of the models of how we respond to digitally to threats, if we follow a biological model, because if we deploy, the body deploys automatically to deal with, and it's very efficient. I mean, it's not always succeeding in winning in battles, but it deploys quickly. White blood cells go where they need to go. It's deployed without shutting down other systems. If you need to go to work, sometimes as long as you're, it's constantly. And so it's interesting how this intersection for you follow this evolutionary biology interest, doing modeling. And so what are your thoughts about that?
So I think we have to, exactly what you said, we have to emulate ecosystems, we have to emulate networks if we're going to be resilient and responsive and move with speed for the exponential era ahead. And so for public service, that's why I use the word public service. If I want to be deliberately provocative, I'll say federal government is a 20th century word that's increasingly out of date. Because if you think about it, I mean, most of us have either a regular phone or a smartphone. Smartphones nowadays have more computing power than what President Reagan apparently had in the early 1981 period.
I can see it, yeah.
And so you have a supercomputer in your pocket per 1980s standards. How many of us would be willing to volunteer if we knew it was going to be treated anonymously and with our privacy intact? Air quality information, water quality information, transportation quality information, that if we volunteered that information would make our local communities healthier or even safer. I mean, you look at what happened about 3 weeks ago in New York. There was the incident where they were trying to find someone who was a suspect. And by involving the community, they were able to quickly identify and actually deal with it. And so what I would submit is that prior to the era of internet connectivity and essentially people getting the equivalent of supercomputers in their pockets, the work of what was called government had to be done by government professionals because you just didn't have connectivity.
Sure.
I think that's increasingly outdated. And that's why I use the word public service, because now if the public wants, they can volunteer information. They can even volunteer to actually remix the data in interesting ways if they want. They don't have to, in ways that would actually inform.
So I think I've listened to a video of yours where you talked about that, a real practical example of how kind of scaling to the public sort of breaks the model where we got to go to get the permission from, if we're not getting permission from government, and if we can go to the public, but I think it was on broadband, was it?
Right. I'll give you two examples. One is one we did here at the FCC, and the other one's outside. So at the Federal Communications Commission, I arrived in late 2013, and they had been spending about $4 or $5 million a year to monitor whether or not the broadband connection that you were getting from an ISP was actually the speed that they had promised you. This was with volunteers. It's kind of like Nielsen ratings. And so we wanted to crowdsource it and see if people would be willing to actually share their mobile broadband connection if you're really getting it. However, you can imagine in late 2013 saying, "Hi, I'm with the U.S. government. Would you like to download an app that will monitor your broadband connection?"
Oh my gosh.
Not going to succeed. But we made it open source. And I think that was the sort of brilliance of what was done at the FCC was by making open source, people could check and see, one, they're not collecting your IP address, so they don't know who you are.
It's like on GitHub, do you just...
Yes, on GitHub, we put the code, don't know your IP address, they don't know who you are in a 5-mile radius, and their terms and conditions are only 2 pages long. And when was the last time you downloaded any app that was 2 pages long? And so, while most people never took the time to check the code, a few trusted authorities like ACLU, EFF did. And as a result, by them saying, yes, they're actually doing what they said, they've baked in security and privacy by design. It was the 4th most downloaded app right behind Google Chrome for a while in the iOS store.
Okay.
So to me, that shows that the public, if you can get trust, and part of the trust is being transparent about what the algorithm is doing, they do want to get involved with public service. And that was a motivating factor.
So instead of going to you to govern the private sector, essentially it's almost not a militia, but it's sort of people are volunteering to go in there and do it themselves.
They're doing it themselves, and they were doing it across the entire nation. I mean, all across the country. I mean, it wasn't just certain pockets. I mean, it was the entire, different parts of the nation. People just volunteered to use their existing phone as a sensor that could help inform where was broadband fast, where was broadband slow, where are things that we need to address. And so I think I would imagine doing a similar app for air quality or water quality, if you could collect it on your phone, as long as you were open and transparent about what you're collecting and you make sure you do privacy by design, the public probably would be interested. So another example happened with the earthquake that happened in Haiti. When the earthquake happened in Haiti, SMS still it was usable. And so people were using SMS to send text updates like, hospital, we need some supplies over here, this bridge is down. And there was actually apparently a case where there were 2 women, they were sisters, one of which was 9 months pregnant. She started to go into labor, so her sister's trying to bring her to hospital. And by using SMS text updates for her phone and updating on Facebook as to what was going on, this was actually to provide awareness as to where they were, how they couldn't get around certain roads where these bridges were down. And actually the U.S. Navy was actually able to dispatch a team to bring her back to a hospital ship so she could actually successfully give birth there. So it's what David Brin talks about, which is called surveillance instead of surveillance. So surveillance is done by some authority. Surveillance is we choose to do. It's what we do to each other. So it's the sue part. And
So this is possibly one of the bleed out effects of privacy sort of disappearing in some respects. Then the theory, one of the theories is that essentially makes more transparent, so it makes people better, or makes people essentially you can't hide, so that you make better human decisions. Or
or it's just that to try and collect all that information from any one organization as to what happened with the disaster and the crisis, it would be very time consuming.
Okay,
but by breaking it into smaller pieces as to what's going on with this disaster, you get more localized, more specific information. It doesn't mean that people won't do misinformation. Someone might do misinformation and claim something's not working or is working when it's not. But the many eyes approach will begin to weigh in. And even if someone tries to do the misinformation,
the numbers are so big.
Yeah, it's hard to do. And so it's sort of taking a huge problem and breaking it into smaller chunks.
Okay.
And using, in some respects, people's own self-interest to report about what's going on in their environment.
So you early on were learning how to solve or be aware of big problems and solve it with technology. Have a lens on a human problem that was exponential, big in scope, and then how you can make your impact in that particular area with technology.
Right.
Interesting. And I've been talking on the show a lot recently about exponential change, exponential technologies. A lot of technology folks that listen to the show, and maybe this is a good way for us to kind of talk about how you lead in a world of exponential change. How are you making bite-sized wins towards the bigger whole? Because I think otherwise you can get overwhelmed by the scope of the problem. But you've been dealing with it since you've been 15, 13 years old. So these are not overwhelming to you. You just take them and how do you frame it, and how do you take action?
Sure. So for any leader, technology leader or C-suite leader trying to grapple with the fact that the world is changing exponentially, I think the first thing you have to recognize is even a startup today in 5 or 6 years will have legacy technologies that are out of date. So the good news is we're all going to be burdened with legacy technologies.
Sure.
And we have to come up with a strategy of trying to avoid having them draw us down too much. Now, FCC, when I first arrived, they had 207 different systems, all on premise, average age more than 10 years old. We had some that were 19, 20 years old. They were consuming more than 85% of our IT budget just to maintain them.
Wow.
We didn't have to do anything.
85%.
85% and growing. And I knew, I was like, this is just not sustainable. Plus, there had been 9 CIOs in 8 years, and so I'm number 10, and I'm sure everyone's looking at their watch saying, how long is this guy going to last? So I put forward 3 things, which is, 1, we have to get out of the business of trying to maintain systems ourselves. We have to get out of the business of maintaining code ourselves, because that's not our forte. Our forte is trying to meet the mission with the public, with our different stakeholders in industry, to essentially be that trusted broker on issues involving communication. And so with that proposition, then we actually were able to say, well, let's move to public cloud. Let's move to commercial service provider. Let's get out of the business of trying to run IT ourselves, because that's just not scalable. And in 2013, that was kind of controversial. People are like, well, if you go to public cloud, how do you know it's not going to be hacked into? I was like, nothing on the internet is going to be completely secure. However, what you can do is you can increase your resiliency and increase, again, the number of eyes looking at it. And if I just do it on premise, it's just my people.
Sure.
If I do a public cloud solution, it's my people plus whatever that vendor is. And so I get sort of a economy of scale. Plus, that vendor is going to have their economy of scale of updating the system and doing the right patching, as opposed to me having to take that burden on. Right. So that's why we did it. But at the time, there were a lot of people that said, this guy's going to flame out. It's not going to work. And maybe it will still flame out. Who knows? Hasn't yet. The second thing, though, was I had seen, again, referencing my days with the bioterrorism program at the CDC, that top-down cannot respond fast enough to a rapidly changing world.
Okay.
So I wanted to empower the edge. And so I told all the team members, both the existing government employees, but also the contractors, I said, I want to empower the edge. So if you see something that we can do that will allow us to get an exponential increase in speed or efficiency or resiliency, make me a pitch. Give me 3 reasons why we should do it. Give me 3 reasons why we should not, because a lot of times people don't think about that. And with those 3 reasons why we should not, then come with how are we going to mitigate those 3 reasons why we should not do it. Maybe it's that this is going to create some distress because people are used to having their data on premise.
So show me why it won't work.
Right.
Come up with your great ideas. Show me why it won't work. Give me 3 ideas, and then how it's going to work.
Yes.
Okay.
And how you're going to actually get around the challenges of it not working.
But that's a concept that I think a lot of enterprise CIOs struggle with. But that's exactly so you're pulling the ideas from the edge.
Yes.
Which is essentially, be too esoteric, but the reality is it's a biological response. You're getting data right from the edge of the ecosystem. ecosystem, right, and to make decisions.
I mean, it's rare that you ever get a chance to write a PhD that you then get to put in practice, but that's exactly what my PhD was on.
Really interesting.
I call it ecosystem approaches. And basically, with an ecosystem, if you shape the incentives, if you shape the normative values, and you shape the trust of any environment, that'll make people more willing to be free agents and identify on the edge what's going on, and you'll get better organizational responses and output. And so I see as my levers as a leader is the narrative I'm using to motivate people, the incentives to motivate them. And yes, this is public service, so we don't necessarily have an IPO, but I can give them a shout out at the team meeting. I can recognize them on Twitter and say, thank you for a great job. They can have a meeting with the chairman. The chairman can give them the kudos. And, in a lot of respects, what science and psychology has shown is if you give people autonomy and measurable progress and a meaningful mission, in some respects, that's in a lot of ways worth it more to people than salary. And after some point, once you meet a certain threshold. And so that's what I tell people. Is like autonomy, measurable progress, which actually, it's why we play video games. People play video games because you're working points. It actually helps me to have measurable progress too, because I want to know how they're doing as to, do I need to help them pivot or not? And then meaningful purpose. We've got plenty of needs here in public service that are really impactful for the nation. And so I have found that, and we actually had cases where there was one individual, Dusty Lown, change agent 001, I call him.
Look, you're using that 00 theme here, right?
They all have licenses to change. Maybe not to kill, but licenses to change. Maybe kill old systems to build it. So he was one of our first change agents that parachuted in. He had been working on the West Coast. He had his own company startup. And initially we intrigued him, and he met, and he said, well, maybe I'll do 1 day a week. And so he did it 1 day a week. He would telework. He's like, well, maybe I'll do 3 days a week. And then he started flying here. And he's actually started liking the vibe. And people, to his credit, he brought his West Coast vibe. However, what he also did, which I think is really crucial to his success, is he took the time to also understand the existing narratives, the existing system that he sought to disrupt. So it wasn't that he just parachuted in and said, well, everyone follow me. It was, how's the different relationships here? And then how am I going to intentionally disrupt that? And he was very successful. He earned trust. He brought them along. And but to his credit, and then he actually ended up moving here full time to DC. He still has a startup on the side. Which is like, I'm fine, So it's one of those things that you don't have to do in either or. If you want to do a startup and work for public service.
See, that's an interesting piece, though, because as you know, my work with Singularity, that's one of the big pieces of looking for disruptors.
Right.
So who's going to disrupt you, and then either align with them, partner with them, which you did, bring them in. And so that's a core strategy to embrace the pace of change.
Yes. If we don't disrupt ourselves, somebody else will. And for public service, if we don't disrupt ourselves, then you start to have interesting issues.
Because you've been vocal about this. You said you're not sure that government can keep pace with change and its ability to govern.
Right.
Because some of these technologies are going right around government without asking for permission.
Right. Well, and I think that raises the question of how do we address that? If we don't figure out a way to move with agility and speed, and I hope we've done a mini experiment, but it's just a mini experiment at the FCC to show that we can. Because 2 years after I had parachuted in, instead of spending 85%, it's now less than 50%, and that was done on a flat budget.
Okay.
In the past, if you had asked us to stand up a new system, it would have taken 6 or 7 months to stand up a new system. If you give us requirements, we can have a working prototype in less than 48 hours now. And that's because we're remixing micro cloud services in interesting ways.
So you can test and experiment a concept or an idea in less than 48 hours.
Exactly.
And this is what this guy helped to bring this ethic in.
It was him. I want to give shout outs to Sarah Milliken, Steve Vaughn, Lily Sewell.
No, let's do that. On the show notes, we'll reference them. We'll reference them.
It really was a team, and it was a network approach, which was, again, it was me almost being like an internal venture capitalist on the inside.
I like that. That's great.
And then just saying, run as fast as you can. I'll give you top cover. Work with the stakeholders. Recognize you got to bring them along, but run as fast as you can.
So you're kind of using like a Google incubator idea. I'm sure that you probably did
service.
Okay, and the public service. So basically, now how do you know? How can you tell an idea is just crap? Do you let them run and then put a governor on it saying if it doesn't produce, if I can't see something out of this micro experiment, then you got to move on to something else?
Well, so part of it is if they come to me and they have 3 great reasons why, but they don't have any real reasons why not. Okay. That tells me you've not talked to the stakeholders. The challenge is if you truly work in the private sector, you don't have laws that say you have to keep this existing system going. oftentimes we have this thing that says existing system needs to keep on going, even though it's more than 15 years old and nobody's using it anymore. And so if they tee it up and if they have that good reason, which was why we shouldn't, like, we can't do this because there's a law against it, and so you're going to have to go talk to Congress, David. I'm like, okay, I'll take that on. But if they've not really thought through why we shouldn't, that tells me they've not talked to enough stakeholders yet.
Okay.
They don't understand the environment they're trying to disrupt. But if they do, and then I can work with them as to how we're going to get around it. Maybe it's going to be, we have an individual by the name of Tony Summerlin. We call him Light Touch.
Okay.
He's kind of our negotiator. He's anything but Light Touch. When we send in the negotiator, Tony Summerlin is the negotiator. But that, to me, when you show that you've done second and third order thinking, it's great. If not, then I'm a little more cautious. I'm like, well, why don't we come back to this in another 3 or 4 days after you've had a chance to talk to more stakeholders? Then if they run forward and it turns out it's not working out, generally I'll be checking in about every 30 to 45 days. If 30 to 45 days it's not working, then we'll say, okay, well, how do we pivot? Now, what we do, when I first arrived, there used to be these massively long meetings, which made no point in terms of updates. We have now just 20 minutes on Mondays and Thursdays. That's the entire team update.
I love it.
And the change agents get to go up on stage themselves. We have this thing called the boardwalk. It's outside here. The top 10 things we're working on, they know they only have 20 minutes total for the entire. So they know if they talk more than 2 minutes, they're eating someone else's time. And it really is just going, well, okay, anything we need to fix? What do we need to pivot? Any issues and things like that? And then if there's anything more than that, it can be talked about after.
Interesting. So you're almost like keeping like a portfolio of projects and ideas that are essentially your experiments at the edge,
right,
and see which ones are going to have some bite and build some steam.
Yes, and I'm counting on them. I use the doctrine of, I call it the doctrine of no surprises, which is I know there's going to be 2x4s that are going to hit me in the back of the head. Just let me know they're coming before they hit me in the back of the head.
Okay. How would you define a meaningful experiment? Is there a budget around it? Like, are you given sort of a slush fund for $1,000, $5,000, $10,000 experiments? Or are a lot of these experiments just using free tools and people's time?
So by going to a platform approach and having software as a service platform in place, people can experiment with the existing platform and services in place without having us to invest in a new one.
Okay.
In some respects, I look at like we're giving you different pieces of a quilt. How you stitch them together, that's something you can do. Now, in some cases, there's not an existing software as a service or platform as a service tool. And so then, unfortunately, there are definitely no slush funds. That's not how the way that public service works is you have to tell the administration and Congress how you're going to spend your budget, and usually you have to tell them a year in advance. And so it makes it a little bit challenging. But we do have funds that are earmarked for IT improvements.
Okay.
Or funds for upgrading our existing infrastructure. And so in that, then we have a process in which it's called capital planning, in which people can actually propose, I want to try and invest in this platform. And usually we'll work with the vendors and we'll work out some arrangement where it's not, we just bought it for 5 years because you get 6 months in and realize it's not working. But it's usually to try it, to see how it goes. If it goes well, then we do the larger bite and the larger bite after that. And so when anyone calls me from the outside as a vendor, because I get a lot of calls, I say, well, you really need to work with one of our change agents first, because don't come to me. I mean, again, I'm going to be sort of assessing what are the different experiences.
You're the portfolio manager.
Yes. Work with one of our change agents that understands the mission context.
Okay.
Is this something that's needed for public safety, or is this something that's needed for the International Bureau or for wireless or consumers? They'll understand the mission context in which we're bringing this. And this is where I like to say there are no IT projects. There are mission projects that have IT baked into them.
Okay.
And then when you come and make the pitch, you're actually pitching me on the value of the mission input that then happens to have IT based into it. And it's got an alignment of a vendor plus a change agent on the inside. And then I invest in it. And the vendor knows. They're on the hook as much as the change agent to see what they can do. Now, if it doesn't work out, we learn something. The only thing I say is let's make sure we don't repeat the same learning experiment twice. Let's learn from it and move on.
And have a tangible learning point for it.
But I would say our batting average is pretty good. And again, as witness, we've gotten speed. And on a flat budget, we now can use the money that we had been spending to maintain old systems by now going to public cloud and commercial service provider to begin to actually untangle some of the really old systems that have, like we have some systems that are in 4 different languages. They have a data model that has been revised at least 5 or 6 different times. And so you have to, and so obviously if you tried to bite that all at once, you wouldn't be able to swallow. So what they're doing now is running some things with the commercial service provider that are the old things, and in the public cloud, using an existing platform with minimal changes to it, minimal customization, move modules over time. And so you can show that you can, basically it's like retrofitting a old MD-80
Yeah.
to a Boeing 777 in mid-flight.
Yeah. But you've already, a huge impact, 3 years, reduced by 35%.
Yes.
Now, what I want to talk about next is your concept of some of the leadership principles. So you made a difference between a leader. I think a lot of people could benefit from this.
Sure.
Is your concept of leading versus managing, and maybe in the context of exponential change. I'll let you give it some thunder, because I think I know where you're going to go, but I'd love to hear your response to that.
Sure. One of the first things I share whenever I parachute in an organization is there is a difference between management and leadership. Management is when we do what's expected of us. And to some degree, we have to do that. If we don't meet the expectations of our boss to a degree, or our peers, or our reports, we're quickly out of a job. And in public service, we actually have expectations from the U.S. public, from the Congress and administration as well. So there's some added pressures. Leadership, however, is when we step outside of expectations. And it actually comes from the Greek word lead, which means to send unto death.
Okay.
And that's because back in ancient Greece, the leads were the ones that carried the flag in front of the melee army.
Mm.
And that's all well and good until one melee army meets another melee army, and the first to die, of course, are the leads, because they're carrying the flag. And the reason why this is so crucial for exponential times is if all we do is meet expectations, we will continue to fall behind. And not just fall behind incrementally, we'll fall behind exponentially, because we will be proceeding on. And so we have to step outside of expectations. However, I can tell you tons of stories throughout my career. I mean, I already gave you one at the CDC where people were like, buy into the 5-year plan, follow waterfall when I was doing Agile. But there are other times too. I mean, there's been times, Department of Defense, intelligence community, FCC even, where people said, get back in your box. And we're like, but I enjoy being outside of my box. And so any effective leader needs to recognize that when you step outside of expectations, you're going to incur friction.
Mm.
Someone's not going to be happy.
It's not comfortable.
Yeah, they're going to say, you're not doing what I expected of you, get back in. And they're going to try and pressure you back in. And interestingly enough, oftentimes the people that pressure you back in, well, it may come from your boss. Oftentimes it comes from your support base.
Mm.
Nelson Mandela said his most trying moment as a leader was when he had to turn to his own party, the African National Congress, and said, we're going to make peace with the white minority as opposed to having a violent revolution. He almost had a coup from his own support base. Isaac Rabin, an Israeli, when he actually turned to his own Israeli people and said, we're going to make peace with the Palestinians, he was actually assassinated by an Israeli.
Mm.
And so a good leader needs to recognize that your own support base may say, yeah, go further on the ice, go further on the ice. And before you know it, you're so far on the ice that you fall through and you're like, where'd you go? I don't know. And nobody's going to help you. And so when you incur friction, have a strategy for how you're going to sort of control it at just the right level where it's enough to begin to melt through the jello.
Okay.
And move the car forward in some respects. I often say that you need friction to move the car forward. But if all you're doing is spinning your wheels and just creating heat and light, that's not going to help anybody. And so make sure you're moving forward and bringing people along. It doesn't mean you have to bring along everybody. Some people may not end up on the journey. But make sure you're managing the friction, and that in the end you have a strategy that, maybe in the end you do have to get killed for the, in some respects there's examples of leaders that metaphorically had to be killed or physically had to be killed to help their people get to a better place. But whatever it is, be aware of that. And also recognize that, quite frankly, when you're initially being a leader, people may not like you initially.
Well, you also talked about risk and transparency now too as a leader, that I think you had maybe you could share that story too. Sure. About in a very transparent world, how do you hide your mistakes?
Well, I don't think you can hide your mistakes, let's be honest. And so on that, so when I arrived at the FCC, I wanted to create a FCC_CIO Twitter account. And they said, well, why? And I said, well, our middle name is communications. And they said, well, you can do a personal account. And I was like, I don't think people care about me personally. I don't think I'm that interesting personally, but I do think the FCC CIO would be useful. And so I ended up creating an account in November of 2013. And the goal was to have conversations about the challenges we were facing, just because I knew it was going to be hard. And actually, the first week that I created the account, I was going through some old file folders and everything that had been left by my predecessors, and I found a still unopened, shrink-wrapped 56K modem.
Really? Did you take a picture of it?
I did, and I posted it on Twitter.
Oh, no way.
Because I was like, I gotta have a sense of humor about this, which is hopefully our upgrades will be better than this. It's like, because what are you gonna do? Either laugh or cry? I'll choose to laugh. I mean, what have I gotten myself into? But that allowed me to begin to have conversations that said, look, yes, we know our systems are old. Yes, we know they need to be updated. Some of them look like they were developed in 1999. In fact, they may have very well been developed in 1999. So we recognize that. We also have flat budget. We have constrained resources, and so we're going to have to do a prioritized approach, but I am open to your recommendations from the public as to what we should prioritize first. And so by being open, that began to at least put some humanness to the role, that it wasn't just some bureaucrat.
Right.
And so I think that was useful. The other thing, though, is also if things went wrong, they knew they could email me or tweet me. And I think, we knew that there are risks to what we were doing, but it was, in my opinion, there was even more risk to not doing anything, to maintaining the status quo. And so by having that conversation, if something's not working, and we can talk about it, doesn't mean, and again,
it's analogous to the Greek the story you just mentioned with the guys who walked out in front. That's your account to walk out in front.
Carry the flag, and hopefully I won't run into another flag that's going to spear me. Who knows? But it was humanness, and I think the other example I would give in terms of being transparent is, let's think about the example of a young Ensign Nimitz. So back in 1904, a young Ensign Nimitz with the U.S. Navy.
Ensign Nimitz.
Ensign Nimitz.
Yeah.
It was Chester Nimitz. He ran his boat aground in 1904 in USS Decatur in the Philippines. He was court-martialed, assigned to submarines, which at the time was not a glorious assignment, but 35 years later became one of only 2 5-star admirals we ever had. Now, let's play this in today's era. An ensign, lieutenant commander runs his boat aground in the Philippines. One, how long on Twitter and Facebook would have been Fire Nimitz? How many news pundits and comedians would have been, what was he thinking? You could see it lampooned.
Incompetent, all this. Right.
And his boss's boss would have probably been called before Congress, and we would have probably been out a future 5-star admiral. And actually, the thing that I found out even more recently is apparently there's actually now against U.S. Navy code, if you run your boat aground even once, you're automatically out. No exceptions. So I asked the question, which is why I celebrate that the internet has made us more transparent. Does it make us less tolerant of individuals that take risk, learn from their mistakes, and as a result, are we selecting for public leaders that are risk averse? And so, again, I'm doing this interview with you right now. Who knows? Maybe tomorrow I might have something that has me flipped out.
But it comes to your philosophy about of taking innovation at the edge and being more agile, whether we're in government or private sector. This is a strategy, but also we have to weave in empathy and mistakes and accountability, and can we brush things under the rug? We this is just a mistake. We're just going to keep moving along with this person, right. And when the public can run in and have its say on that, it's very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's
like tolerance. It's very much a tolerance.
I think is definitely needed, and I think that maybe the challenge is: does the internet make it easier to be tolerant, or does the internet make it easier to be intolerant? Is unclear. I have seen interesting things so one statistic that's worth noting, of the countries involved with the Arab awakening, this is according to World Bank, every country except for Tunisia is now worse off as a result of the Arab awakening in terms of their economy or in terms of their social and economic structure than they were before it. And so the question is why? And there may be many different factors. I do wonder if the internet makes it easier for intolerance to be spread versus tolerance. It's harder for people when you're in an anonymized context to identify that really we're all human. When we're talking to each other right now, we see each other as human, we have eye contact. Yeah. We lose that some on the internet. And so I think that's an interesting question that's worth asking. The other question that's worth asking is, had the Berlin Wall fallen not in 1989, but fallen in 2009, would have been easier for detractors to spread misinformation and make it less of a peaceful transition as it was as a result. So this is where I think we really need to have conversations about what is the future of any type of representative democracy, any type of republic. I do think the future is going to be thinking about as public service and being networked, involving the public in doing things if they want, that in the past had to be done by government professionals. I also think it's involving more public-private partnerships that don't have to necessarily have things always done by government. But if there is a role for what the future of public service is, we do need to have a place where you can establish trust. And it's not just by government professionals. Again, by having that conversation on social media, we do make a lot of our data open source, and I'm increasingly trying to liberate data from some of our old legacy systems. That allows the public to weigh in and to see why certain decisions are being made, or actually be able to analyze the data themselves. Again, we're doing it on a flat budget, but we're doing as fast as we can.
Well, David, one of the things I'm curious about is artificial intelligence, and this is sort of an interesting. People have in two different camps about this as we move forward. Can you talk to how you think artificial intelligence type technologies will essentially could assist and help amplify and do good
Sure.
with our existing workers, both in public and private sector. I think it's important to hear your perspective on it because I think we're hearing a lot of the downside piece, which is easy to find, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on possibly the upside.
Sure. And I think it's worth saying it's interesting to talk about the downside versus upside. I mean, in my view, technology is amoral. It's how we humans choose how to use technology that determines whether it's good or bad. For example, fire, you can cook your food, keep your family warm, that's great. But fire can also burn and unfortunately kill. And so it's how you use the tool that decides whether it's good or bad. And so that's the choices we need to think about. So in terms of AI, in 2013, there was a competition to see if anyone could write a algorithm that would grade papers as good as a third grade teacher, find the same sentence mistakes and things like that. And sure enough, someone could. It was on Craigle, and it was a hedge fund trader that had some free time. 2014, there was a competition. Xerox came out with a copier that will take a handwritten test, handwritten answer, and again, at the third grade level, grade it for the teacher. Now, it's more expensive than teachers right now, so teachers aren't a job yet, but who knows. 2015, some of the AIs that are prominent out there by different vendors are actually being tested in Fortune 500 companies to see which meetings you should go to, which meetings you should not go to, and if you do go to those meetings, who you should take with you. There was actually also a case where a company elected to its board of directors an algorithm and gave it voting rights. And then this year, 2016, there are efforts afoot to see if they can actually do an AI that will be able to answer real estate law as good as, and real estate law is very rule-based, so it's a little bit easier. There's other parts of law that's not as rule-based, to see if you can do it as good as a real estate lawyer. And early signs are it can be about 80% accurate right now.
Wow.
And so I think about a lot of what's done, particularly in public service, is rote and repetitive and involves many different people because you want to remove as much bias as possible. And by having many different people involved, it's hard for any one person to be, again, the founders did not want a king-like individual.
Right.
But on things like procurement or hiring decisions, if instead of having many different people involved in a very prolonged, protracted process, if you made the algorithm open source, it would be interesting to see, maybe it's not initially the hiring decision, but maybe it's just the job classification as to what type of job this is, or maybe in the procurement, it's like, is this...
The RFP process.
Yes, is this a compliant RFP? Is it FAR compliant? And you still have humans in the loop. I don't think it replaces.
Sure.
But it's trying to shorten the time needed to do something and then involve the human in the creative part or the key decision-making part. There's another example, actually, that's just happened this year. I think California is actually trying to use algorithms to set bail.
Okay.
And the idea that, again, it's just going to look at the facts of the case. It's not going to be biased as to whether you're tall or not tall or if you're a certain gender or things like that. And so, again, it's not, I think the future, at least for the next 10 years, is not an either or. It's about how do you pair artificial intelligence with humans to make better outcomes.
It's interesting. I spoke at the Construction Industry Association meeting last week, and I said, many 50, 60 years ago when we invented the steam shovel and the bulldozer and all these, people were upset because the manual labor was being replaced. And the guy who had the 100 horses at the time the car was invented is really upset. However, we looking at history, looking at years later, these efficiency gains on doing some of the more rote and manual mental task frees us up to potentially do more higher order thinking, pushes us in a different path. It's just we can't see it. It's an algorithm versus a tractor or a truck or something like of that nature. Interesting.
I would love to have an AI help answer emails for me.
That's a good point. Well, as we wrap up, one of the things that I think would really help is what you've mentioned a couple mentors and a couple people that I'd love to give people resources they can go to kind of learn about some of your mentors that they may think, that and you do some further learning and possibly books and things that you found were really good from a leadership or a technology perspective. But maybe we'll start with your mentors first. Who do you think would be good for people to go read about? Yeah.
Right. Well, so probably most of them are behind the scenes, part of the nature of public service. But I would say they range from, as I mentioned already, there was the Dr. William Jeffrey. I believe last I heard from him, he's the president of SRI. He would be one. Another one, Dr. Tracy Tridwell.
Okay.
She was with the bioterrorism program with me, trained as both an epidemiologist and a veterinarian, and was very key with me with the bioterrorism program. And then at Emory University, was at a business school, Dr. Ben Kaczynski.
Dr. Ben Kaczynski, okay.
And that's Ben with two N's.
Okay.
In fact, he likes to call his graduates, he likes to call them SOBs or students of Ben. So I am a proud SOB. So.
That's great. What about books? Any books that you could recommend?
Highly recommend. So actually, I probably will actually recommend some short articles.
Okay.
One is there's a wonderful article that's called "In Praise of the Incomplete Leader."
Oh, I've heard you mention that.
It's
Yeah.
Harvard Business Review. It's about the myth that, again, that the leader has to know everything. But in fact, the reality is that they open themselves up to having people point out their blind spots. I think they're better leaders as a result. And so that's what I try to embody with my team is, I know I'm going to have blind spots. The world's changing so fast, but we can share amongst ourselves and point out these different blind spots and be better as a result. So that would be a key one. There's also work. So Tom Malone and others have done work on diversity.
Okay.
And window diversity. He's at the Center for Collective Intelligence. So that would be, website would be cci.mit.edu. And did my postdoc with him. And he's done research as to when do different groups of people make better decisions versus similar groups of people. And he finds out there's some interesting findings. One is if there's equal turn-taking in the conversations, if there's active listening, and then probably the most interesting provocative finding that he and other, Anita Woolsey has also helped with, when there's a higher ratio of women to men. Which might be because maybe there's two other things in terms of equal turn-taking, conversation, and active listening. But it's worth reading because it's empirical data.
Interesting.
And I think the bigger takeaway is at the C-suite level for any organization, and particularly true for public service, we need to make sure we have a diversity of cognitive thought because you'll have better outcomes.
Actually, I've actually heard that. I'm at an entrepreneurship leadership group that meets in Philly every quarter, and the woman who runs it. Mm-hmm. She said, and the first one, she goes, "We're just at the cusp of having too few women," and they'd actually know they can tell. She goes, "I can tell by the energy and the vibe and the ideas and the thought. Mm-hmm. It's just there's a more holistic perspective when you have that. So that's really interesting."
Yeah, and in fact, if I could do one final sort of plug, is there's a thing called the Executive Leadership Conference that happens every year, and I actually am going to be chairing it this year in late October. However, when they asked me way back in January this year to help chair, I said I would on only three conditions, which is one, 50% or more of the speakers we invite are women, 25% or more are Gen X, Gen Y, and 25% or more are outside of the DC area. Unfortunately, I said yes. So.
Oh wow! We'll put show notes to that as well.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there any final comments or anything that you're like itching to say that you wanted to? Or
well, the one thing I would recommend, because you talked about empathy, and I think that's so key. Organizational empathy is something that you can have the best intended, whether a computer scientist, biologist, public policy maker. If you don't have organizational empathy, that's a huge missing talent that often is not brought to bear. And so the one thing I'd recommend to any leader in any circumstance, when you're getting to know your other team members, ask them what brings them joy, which I know is kind of odd because initially they're going to be like, well, why are you asking this? But the reality is, at the end of the day, life's too short to not be doing something that at least brings us some intrinsic happiness or intrinsic motivation. And by asking what brings us joy, that helps you. One, you're actually listening to them and you're watching their facial expressions and you see what gets them excited. But then two, if later there's a task that needs to be done and it happens to align closely to what their passion and their joy is, they're going to tackle it a whole lot more because they are intrinsically motivated. And so I think, interesting enough, since we've ranged from technology to artificial intelligence, we still need to remember at the end of the day, humans, we have motivations. Yeah. And if we can understand those motivations, we can do great things.
There's a great book I just interviewed the author for called Joy Inc. Mm-hmm. And another woman, your concept of EQ versus IQ, the emotional quotient piece versus IQ, we're all very, very top heavy on IQ,
right.
But pulling that empathy piece in on the emotion side is huge for that. I really appreciate your comments there.
Well, thank you, Bill. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, until next time, thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
So that wraps up my interview, conversation, and discussion with Dr. David Bray. Thank you for your most precious resource, which is your time. And I hope you learned today some of the thinking from what I would consider the best of the best. Learn from the top, associate, listen to, be a fly in the wall with thinking from the top. And that's my goal for you, is to do and listen as you drive to work, as you're doing the dishes, whatever it is, however you're consuming this program. I appreciate you again, and thank you for listening. Until next time, this is Bill Murphy. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's RedZone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.